Good morning. B.F. Skinner, a world-famous psychologist, proved in his life's work that when we offer encouragement to another person, what we do is build strength upon strength in that individual's life, both in the quality of their life and in the work that they produce. But when we offer criticism, what we do is demoralize them, tear them down, and the work they produce becomes of poor quality. Encouragement rather than criticism. The Apostle Paul could have written that. Throughout the New Testament, in Paul's letters, Paul writes that we are to be encouragers of one another. Paul understands that as we encourage one another, we build up the people that we are encouraging. And as we build people up, we build up the faith community. But if we offer criticism, we demoralize them, we tear them down, and the quality of their work suffers. Yesterday we had a brief but meaningful memorial service for someone in this congregation that many of you know and love, Joanne Sopp. Joanne Sopp quickly became one of my favorite people in this congregation shortly after I became the pastor of this church. When I became the pastor of this church a little over 8 years ago, Joanne Sopp introduced herself to me and said, "Pastor, I want to be a blessing. How can I be a blessing? Would you let me know if there's anything that I can do to be a blessing to you and your ministry in this church?" Friends, let me tell you that when pastors begin a new call, a new work, and a new congregation, the congregation is usually divided into 3 groups, not of equal size. The larger group of that congregation will be people who are welcoming and they're warm, and the pastor appreciates them. But then there are still 2 smaller groups. One group will be people who will criticize the pastor. Nothing the pastor does is right. Everything the pastor seeks to do is criticized by these people. Understand, that does not make them bad people necessarily. Usually what is happening when people are critical is that they are grieving. An example, when I went to my church in Texas in 1994, I had only been there a couple of months when a woman came into my office and she said, with a finger pointed right at me, "There's a pew rack where I am seated on Sunday morning that is broken. Had my pastor still be in here, it would have been repaired immediately." Noticed, she said, if her pastor had been here, my predecessor had been there for 27 years. He had been the one who had married, she and her husband had baptized their children and buried her parents. He had earned the right to be called her pastor. And she was grieving now because her pastor was no longer the pastor, and I had stepped into his place. Naturally, I can never step into the place of someone who had loved a person for 27 years. And so therefore, she was criticizing me because a pew rack was broken where she is seated. Understand again, it is so important for us to understand this. When someone is critical of us, most of the time it's not because they are bad people, because they are grieving some loss in their life. Well, then there's a 3rd group, and that 3rd group is either the smallest group. That smaller group are people who come alongside and say, "I want to bless you. I want to encourage you. Let me know what I can do to advance your ministry in this place." Joanne Sopp would belong to that 3rd group. She came to me and said, "Doug, I want to bless you so that your ministry will flourish." Well, after I've been here several months, I noticed quite awkwardly that in our worship space, we had 2 translations of the Bible in the pews. In the sanctuary portion, we had 1 translation. In the covered patio section, we had another translation of the Bible. Also, many of those Bibles had grown so old they were beginning to fall apart, and every one of them were in small print. Adding to the awkwardness, when we printed the worship bulletin, we would have 2 page numbers for each scriptural reading. Simply what the bulletin said is, if you're seated in one place in the sanctuary, you look to this page number. If you're seated in another place in the sanctuary, you look to this page number. I was once told, if there is mist in the pulpit, there is fog in the pew. It confused me, so I was certain it was confusing everyone else. So I went to Joanne and I said, "Joanne, there is something you can do for me. I have learned that you are deeply loved by many members of this congregation." She smiled, She didn't deny it, but she was far too humble to acknowledge it. And I said, and I wish that we could put a brand new Bible in our pews. What I want to do is have a common translation rather than mixed translations. I want to have new Bibles. I want to have a larger print Bible. And I want to have a translation that is fresh, as easy to read as your morning emails. Joanne said, may I have a copy of that book you're proposing? And I said, oh, yes, I've got it in my office now. She said, let me look at it this week, and I'll speak to you next Sunday. The next Sunday, Joanne said, I think this is a good idea. Naturally, you've got to get the governing board to approve replacing all the Bibles in the church, but tell them that I think it's a good idea. That was the closest she ever came to acknowledging. She was indeed a E.F. Hutton in this congregation. I shared with the session that Joanne Sopp thought it was a good idea that we replace all of our Bibles, and I received no resistance whatsoever. Joanne also said that if anybody in the congregation calls you and criticizes you for the move that you made, ask them to call me. I did receive 3 phone calls, 3 people who were very upset that I would replace the Bibles that were here when I arrived. I told them Joanne would like to speak with you. I never heard from them. What I want to say to you is that we choose to become someone who encourages and blesses, or we choose to become someone who criticizes. Not just the pastor, but one another in our families, our friends, our relationships in the church and the community. We all have a choice. E.F. Skinner, absolutely right. If we reward and encourage, we build strength and strength in an individual. Criticize, we demoralize them, cut them down, and the result is always poor performance. This church is built upon the encouragement. And I'm asking you to search your heart and ask, are you an encourager, or are you someone who criticizes? Church is blessed because there are